I grew up in a fortress I called home. My mother told me the 10-foot walls were for my protection. My father told me the combat training was just for fitness. I believed them. Until my 22nd birthday when I found out I wasn't a daughter. I was a transaction. The man standing across from me isn't just a CEO with 2 Ivy League degrees and a multi-billion-dollar empire. He's the most feared mafia boss in the underworld, and according to a blood pact signed before I was born, I belong to him. But the rival families didn't get the memo. They think I'm the weak link. They think I'm just a princess to be kidnapped to start a war. They have no idea that my mother is the most dangerous financial hitwoman in the country, or that I've been training to kill since I was 13. Tonight, the alliance between the Yun and Kang families is being signed in blood. Will I be the pawn that falls or the queen who takes the board? Stick around because this isn't just a marriage. It's a hostile takeover. The walls of the Kang estate were 10 feet high, topped with discreetly electrified wire and cameras that never blinked. To the world, it was a mansion. To 21-year-old Eleanor, it was a fortress. "I'm leaving, Elle," her mother Sarang said, adjusting the collar of her sharp silk blazer. In the morning light, she didn't look like a housewife. She looked like a general. Most people knew her as Patricia, the woman who handled the logistics for the Kang family. "You're always leaving, Iyama," Eleanor replied, nursing a cup of tea. Sarang leaned down, kissing Eleanor's forehead. Her scent was always the same, expensive perfume and a faint, metallic tang of iron. "I am making sure all things work well for you. Your uncle is busy with the family business, and someone must keep the gears turning." Eleanor looked over at her father, Charles. He was a tall, quiet Caucasian man with wire-rimmed glasses, buried in a mountain of spreadsheets. He was an accountant, the steady anchor to her mother's storm. He gave Eleanor a small, sympathetic smile but said nothing. "Don't forget," Sarang called out from the door. "Instructor Kim is in the gym at 10. No excuses. You need to know how to defend what is yours." Eleanor sighed. Since she was 13, her life had been a cycle of economics tutors and tactical defense. She was half Korean, half Caucasian, a blend of her mother's sharp features and her father's striking height. But in this house, she wasn't a girl, she was a project. University was supposed to be Eleanor's escape, but even there, she felt the invisible hand of her family. On her 18th birthday, she hadn't received a car or a party. She had received a black box with a crest she didn't recognize, a dragon entwined with a crane. Inside was a diamond bracelet worth more than her tuition. The note simply read, "Wait for me." "Who is Hyeon Yun?" Eleanor had asked her mother that night. The room had gone silent. Her father's pen stopped moving. Her mother's eyes turned to cold flint. "He is the successor of the Yun family," Sarang said slowly. "And as of today, he is your betrothed. It was a pact made before your first breath. The Kangs provide the capital, the Yuns provide the steel." Eleanor felt the world tilt. She had seen the name Hyeon Yun in the business journals. He was 32 now, a man with 2 prestigious degrees who had transformed the Yun syndicate into a global conglomerate. But the tabloids whispered a different story of a man who had purged his own board of directors in a single night of blood. "I won't do it," Eleanor whispered. "You will," Sarang replied, her voice like a closing vault. "Because a storm is coming, Eleanor, and only a Yun can keep you from being swept away." From age 18 to 22, the gifts arrived like clockwork. On her 19th birthday, it was a custom-made handgun with an ivory grip, delivered to her dorm room by a man in a silent black suit. On her 20th, it was the deed to a penthouse in Seoul she wasn't allowed to visit yet. On her 21st, it was a rare, first-edition book on international trade. Each gift was a reminder, "I am watching, you are mine." Eleanor tried to rebel. She dated a fellow student, a boy named Min-ho. They went for coffee once. The next day, Minho's family was suddenly offered a lucrative business opportunity in another country and moved within 48 hours. She realized then that Hyeon wasn't just a fiancé. He was a ghost haunting her life. In her final year of university, Eleanor pushed herself harder. If she was to be a mafia bride, she wouldn't be a victim. She spent her nights in the shooting range and her days mastering her father's accounting books. She discovered her mother wasn't just helping her uncle. Sarang was the shadow CEO of the Kang Empire, laundering the family's reputation through legitimate billions. Eleanor was the daughter of a queen and the prize of a king. The day of Eleanor's 22nd birthday arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat. This was the year the alliance was to be formalized. The Beek family is moving, her uncle, the supposed head of the Kangs, growled during breakfast. He was a loud, aggressive man, but Eleanor noticed how he looked to her mother for permission before he spoke. They've hijacked 2 of our shipments at the docks. They know the Yun alliance makes us untouchable, and they're desperate. They are insects, Sarang said, sipping her tea. But insects can still bite. Eleanor, today you meet him, officially. Charles, her father, finally looked up from his ledgers. His eyes were full of a sadness he couldn't hide. Be careful, El. Hyeon is a man of many layers. Do not let the corporate suit fool you. Eleanor went to her room and dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk. She tucked a small, concealable blade into her garter, a habit her mother had beaten into her. She looked at herself in the mirror. She had her father's blue-gray eyes and her mother's unbreakable jawline. She wasn't just Eleanor anymore. She was the bridge between 2 empires. The gala was held at a private estate in the hills of Seoul. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the underlying tension of 100 armed men in tuxedos. When Hyeon Yun entered the room, the oxygen seemed to leave it. He was taller than she expected, with shoulders that filled out a bespoke Italian suit. His hair was swept back, revealing a face of sharp, predatory beauty. He didn't look like a gangster, he looked like a god of industry. But his eyes, dark, calculating, and ancient, told the truth. He bypassed the elders, the politicians, and the generals. He walked straight to Eleanor. 4 years of gifts, he said, his voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in her chest. And none of them do you justice. Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze. A gift is just a bribe if the recipient doesn't want it, Mr. Yun. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't kind. I like that you have teeth, Eleanor. You'll need them. The Beeks have put a price on your head to stop this wedding. Before she could respond, a muffled thud echoed from the gardens, followed by the shattered glass of the ballroom windows. The lights cut to black. Stay behind me, Hyeon commanded, his hand finding the small of her back. And let's see if those defense classes were worth the money your mother spent. The ballroom was a chaos of shattered crystal and panicked shouts. Eleanor felt Hyeon's hand, firm and steady, guiding her through the dark. She didn't scream. Her training took over. While other socialites ducked under tables, Eleanor reached for the blade hidden against her thigh. The side exit, she whispered, her voice cutting through the noise. The side exit is compromised, Hyeon countered, his voice chillingly calm. Suddenly, the muzzle flash of a suppressed weapon illuminated the room. Hyeon didn't hesitate. He pulled a handgun from a shoulder holster with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold. 2 shots echoed, and the shadowy figure by the curtains collapsed. You're a better shot than your father, Hyeon remarked, eyes scanning the perimeter. My father is an accountant, Eleanor snapped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Your father is a ghost, Eleanor. Your mother is the one who buys the bullets. Hyeon grabbed her arm, pulling her close as a second wave of gunmen crashed through the terrace. Now move. If you want to live to see 23, you do exactly as I say. They didn't head for the front gates where the Yun security team was battling the Beek mercenaries. Instead, Hyeon led her through the service corridors, a maze he seemed to know by heart. Outside, a black armored SUV was idling, its lights off. Hyeon shoved her inside and piled in after her just as bullets peppered the reinforced glass. The driver floored it, the tires screaming against the pavement. Eleanor looked back at the gala. Smoke was rising from the estate where she had spent her life. "My parents are safer than you are," Hyeon interrupted, reloading his magazine with mechanical precision. "Your mother has a bunker that could survive a nuclear strike. You, however, were the target. The Beaks don't want the Yun-Kang merger. They know that with your mother's money and my reach, they'll be erased from the map by morning." Eleanor sank into the leather seat, the adrenaline beginning to fade into a cold, sharp anger. "So I'm just a target, a piece of a merger." Hyeon turned to her. In the dim light of the cabin, his eyes looked like polished obsidian. "You are the most valuable asset in the country, Eleanor, and unlike your mother, I don't intend to hide you in a fortress." They didn't return to her family home. Instead, the SUV climbed the winding roads to a secluded glass and steel monolith overlooking the Han River. This was Hyeon's private residence, a place of cold lines and high-tech security. "You'll stay here," Hyeon stated, stepping out of the car. "My staff will provide whatever you need, but you do not leave the perimeter." "Another cage," Eleanor challenged, stepping out to face him. The wind caught her emerald dress, making her look like a defiant spirit against the city lights. Hyeon stepped into her personal space, his height intimidating. He smelled of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. "A cage keeps things in, Eleanor. This is a stronghold. There is a difference." He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. His touch was electric, a stark contrast to his cold demeanor. "I've spent 4 years watching you from afar, sending you gifts to see how you'd react. I know you're bored of being a princess. Tomorrow, your training shifts from defense to offense." While Hyeon dealt with the fallout of the attack, Eleanor found herself alone in the massive library of his home. She wasn't looking for literature. She was looking for a computer. She used the backdoor coding her father had taught her, the quiet accountant who apparently knew how to bypass international banking firewalls. Within an hour, she was inside the Kang family's private ledger. Her breath hitched. Her father hadn't just been an accountant for her uncle. He was managing a series of offshore accounts that funneled money into Hyeon's corporate ventures. The alliance wasn't just a marriage. It was a decades-long financial weave. Her father was the architect, her mother was the enforcer, and she was the seal. "It's rude to hack your host," a voice drawled from the doorway. Hyeon stood there, his tie loosened, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand. He didn't look angry, he looked impressed. "You knew," Eleanor said, turning the screen toward him. "You've been using my family's money to build your legitimate empire. And I've been using my steel to protect your family's illegitimate interests," Hyeon replied, walking toward her. "It's a perfect circle, one you are now a part of." Hyeon set his glass down and leaned over her, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, effectively pinning her in. "The Beaks think they can strike at me by hurting you," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "They think you're a weakness. We need to show them they've made a mathematical error." Eleanor looked up at him, her defiance flaring. "What do you want me to do?" "Tomorrow, there is a board meeting at Yun Holdings," he said, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "You will sit at my right hand, not as a fiancé, but as the new head of the Kang's financial interest. We show them the union is already complete." He leaned in closer, the tension between them thick enough to ignite. For a moment, the ruthlessness in his eyes softened into something hungrier. "But tonight, you rest. And Eleanor." "Yes." "Don't try to pick the lock on your bedroom door. It's biometric, and I'm the only one with the thumbprint." He straightened up and walked away, leaving Eleanor in the silence of the library, realizing that the fortress she had grown up in was nothing compared to the world Hyeon Yun was about to drag her into. The headquarters of Yun Holdings was a spire of silver that seemed to pierce the very clouds of Seoul. Eleanor walked through the lobby, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. She wore a tailored black power suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, lethal ponytail. At her side, Hyeon was a silent mountain of authority. As they entered the boardroom, the air turned to ice. 20 men, most twice Eleanor's age, sat around a mahogany table. These were the men who controlled the nation's infrastructure, and the men who secretly funded the wars between the families. "This is Eleanor Kang," Hyeon announced, not waiting for them to sit. "As of this morning, she holds the proxy for the Kang family's 40% stake in our joint ventures. Her word is my word." A murmur of dissent rippled through the room. A senior director leaned forward, his eyes mocking. "She's a child, Hyeon. A beautiful one, but a child nonetheless. Does she even know the difference between a hedge fund and a slush fund?" Eleanor didn't wait for Hyeon to defend her. She slid a tablet across the table. "I know that you've been skimming 3% off the Jeju development project into a shell company in Panama," she said, her voice calm and terrifyingly like her mother. "And I know that company is owned by the Beek family. You aren't just a director, Mr. Park. You're a traitor." The room went deathly silent. Hyun's hand rested on the back of Eleanor's chair, his fingers grazing her shoulder in a gesture that was both a shield and a claim. Before Mr. Park could speak, the doors burst open. Hyun's security team didn't hesitate. They escorted the director out of the room in a blur of motion. No one asked where he was being taken. In this world, fired had a much more permanent meaning. The remaining directors sat straighter. They looked at Eleanor not as a prize, but as a predator. "Meeting adjourned," Hyeon said. Once the room cleared, Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling slightly. "You did well," Hyeon said, turning her chair to face him. He sat on the edge of the table, his knees brushing hers. "Most people take years to learn how to draw blood with words. You did it in 10 seconds. "I learned from the best," Eleanor whispered, thinking of her mother's disappearing axe and her father's silent ledgers. "You learned from them," Hyeon corrected, reaching out to tilt her chin up. "But you have a fire they don't. They operate out of duty. You operate out of survival." His gaze intensified, lingering on her lips. "It makes me wonder what else you're capable of." The threat from the Beek family intensified. Intelligence suggested a hit squad had been dispatched to the city. For Eleanor's safety, Hyeon moved her into his primary suite, a vast, open-plan space of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass. "There's only one bed," Eleanor noted, her voice wavering for the first time. "It's the only room in the building with grade 7 reinforced plating," Hyeon replied, shedding his jacket. He began to unbutton his shirt, unbothered by her presence. "I have no intention of sleeping, Eleanor. I have a war to plan, but you need to rest." She watched the play of muscles across his back. The scars there told stories of a decade spent in the trenches of the underworld. He was a man of degrees and boardrooms, yes, but he was also a man of scars and steel. She lay on top of the covers, watching him work at a desk across the room. The rhythmic tapping of his keyboard and the hum of the city below should have been soothing, but the tension between them was a physical weight. "Hyeon. Why me? You could have had any alliance, any woman." He stopped typing and turned, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face. "Because," he said softly, "you were the only one who looked at the gifts I sent and tried to figure out how to use them against me. I didn't want a wife, Eleanor. I wanted a partner who could survive me." It happened at 2 a.m. A distant explosion rocked the building, and the emergency red lights flickered to life. "They're here," Hyeon hissed. He was at the bedside in a second, handing Eleanor a weapon. "The elevators are locked down. They're coming up the service stairs." They moved into the hallway, the air thick with smoke. This wasn't a corporate meeting. This was a slaughter. Hyeon moved with a lethal efficiency, taking down 2 gunmen before they could even level their sights. Eleanor followed his lead. When a third gunman lunged from a doorway, she didn't freeze. She used the defense maneuvers instructor Kim had drilled into her, disarming the man and sending him over the railing of the atrium. They reached the private garage, but as the door opened, a flashbang grenade blinded them. Eleanor felt herself being thrown to the ground. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the sound of a struggle, the heavy thud of fists and the grunt of exertion. When her vision cleared, Hyeon was standing over the last of the assassins, his hands stained red, his chest heaving. He looked like a demon in the red emergency light. He turned to her, real raw panic flashing in his eyes for the first time. He grabbed her, checking her for wounds. "Are you hit? Eleanor, answer me." "I'm okay," she gasped, her hands clutching his ruined shirt. "I'm okay, Hyeon." The adrenaline of the fight crashed into the months of suppressed tension. Back in the safety of the reinforced suite, the door hadn't even fully closed before he pressed her against it. There was no more talk of alliances or mergers. There was only the desperate, hungry need of 2 people who had nearly lost everything. His kiss was a reclamation, hard, demanding, and tasting of salt and copper. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. She didn't want the princess treatment. She wanted the man who had fought for her. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her to the bed. The silk of her dress was a sharp contrast to his rough palms. As he stripped away the remnants of their formal world, the masks fell away. In the heat of the night, their bodies told the truth their lips wouldn't yet admit. Every touch was a promise. Every gasp was a surrender. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't a Kang or a Yun. She was a woman choosing her own destiny, anchored to a man who was both her captor and her savior. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, painting the room in hues of bruised purple and gold, Eleanor watched Hyeon sleep. She realized then that the war with the beaks was just beginning, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding behind a fortress. She was the fortress. The sunlight hit the glass walls like a physical weight. Eleanor woke to an empty bed, the sheets still smelling of Hyeon's cologne and the metallic tang of the night's battle. She sat up, wrapping herself in a silk robe, and found him standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't want excuses." Hyeon's voice was a low growl. "I want their supply lines severed. If a single beak ship leaves the harbor, it's on your head." He hung up and turned to Eleanor. His eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second, before the mask of the Yun boss returned. "You should be resting." "I'm done resting," Eleanor said, standing tall. "Last night they tried to kill us in our sleep. I'm not waiting for a third attempt." Hyeon walked over, his hands resting on her waist. The intimacy of the previous night hung between them, a silent pact. "Your mother called. She's moved your father to a safe house. The beaks didn't just hit us. They hit 3 of the Kangs, counting houses simultaneously. They're trying to bankrupt you while they bleed me." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "They think my father is just an accountant. They think if they take the money, they take the power. They have no idea how the Kangs actually move capital." Eleanor insisted on meeting her mother. They met in an underground parking garage, neutral ground. Sarang looked weary, her usual perfection frayed at the edges. "Where is Dad?" Eleanor demanded. "Safe," Sarang replied shortly. "Eleanor, the Beaks have partnered with a Russian syndicate. This isn't just a local turf war anymore. They want the Yun-Kang merger stopped because it creates a monopoly they can't break." "Then let's give them what they're afraid of," Eleanor said. She pulled out a drive containing the files she'd pulled from her father's hidden server. "Iyama, I know about the offshore accounts. I know how Dad was hiding the Yun's expansion costs. We don't need to fight them with guns. We fight them with the one thing they don't have: liquidity." Sarang looked at her daughter, and for the first time she didn't see a child to be protected. She saw a successor. You have your father's brain for numbers, Eleanor, but do you have my heart for the kill? Try me, Eleanor challenged. While Hyun's men engaged in a bloody street war with the Beak mercenaries, Eleanor sat in the war room of the Yun skyscraper. She wasn't holding a pistol, she was holding a laptop. Beside her, Hyun watched as she executed a series of high-frequency trades. What are you doing? The Beak's wealth is tied up in their shipping company, Eleanor explained, her fingers flying across the keys. I'm shorting their stock while simultaneously triggering a series of audits through their European subsidiaries. By the time the sun sets, their credit lines will be frozen. They won't even have enough money to pay the men shooting at us. Hyun watched her with a mixture of pride and something deeper, a realization that he hadn't just married into a fortune, he had married a genius. You're terrifying, he murmured, leaning down to kiss the side of her neck. I'm a Kang, she replied, leaning back into him, and I'm about to be a Yun. They should have stayed in their lane. The digital attack worked faster than any bullet. By midnight, the Beak family's main compound was in a state of internal collapse. Their mercenaries, realizing they wouldn't be paid, began to desert. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous. We found the leak, Hyun said, entering the room. His face was grim. It wasn't just Director Park, it was your uncle. Eleanor felt a chill. My uncle, the head of the Kang family. He felt sidelined by your mother, Hyun explained. He thought if he helped the Beaks kill us, he could take back the financial control. He's the one who gave them the codes to the ballroom security. Eleanor stood up, her heart turning to ice. Where is he? My men have him at the docks, Hyun said, handing her a coat. This is your family's business, Eleanor. In our world, the head of the family has to deal with their own traitors. I can't do this for you. The air at the Incheon docks was thick with salt and the smell of industrial oil. Inside a rusted warehouse, Eleanor's uncle sat tied to a chair, his face bruised and bloody. Eleanor walked into the circle of light. Behind her, Hyun stood like a silent shadow, his presence a warning to anyone who might interfere. Eleanor, you have to listen, her uncle begged. They promised me. They said they'd keep the family intact. You sold me to the Beaks, Eleanor said, her voice devoid of emotion. She looked at the man who had sat at her dinner table for 20 years. You tried to kill the woman who built your empire, my mother. She turned to Hyun. Give me your gun. Hyun didn't hesitate. He placed the heavy weight of his custom pistol in her hand. The cold metal felt familiar, a part of her. Eleanor leveled the weapon. Her training with Instructor Kim, the years of self-defense, the fortress, it all led to this moment. She wasn't the girl in the emerald dress anymore. She was the woman who would rule at Hyun's side. For the family, she whispered. Click. She didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she lowered the gun and looked at Hyun. Killing him is too easy. He loves power more than life. Strip him of the Kang name. Take every cent he has. Send him to the mainland with nothing but the clothes on his back. Let him watch from the gutters while we build the world he was too small to imagine. Hyun smiled, a real dark, admiring smile. He took the gun back and tucked it away. Cruel, I like it. He pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the warehouse. The alliance is formalized, Eleanor, not because of a contract, but because of you. The dust from the dockside confrontation hadn't even settled before the world knew the Kangs and Yuns were no longer just betrothed. They were a single, unstoppable unit. Eleanor's uncle had been scrubbed from every legal document, replaced by Eleanor herself as the official head of financial operations for the combined empires. In the week leading up to the wedding, the fortress she once called home felt different. Her father, Charles, sat with her in the garden. You've changed, Elle, he said softly. I spent 20 years trying to keep the blood off your hands. I failed. You didn't fail, Dad, Eleanor replied, looking at her reflection in a silver tea set. You gave me the foundation. Mom gave me the fire. I'm just using both. Hyeon is a dangerous man, Charles warned. I know, Eleanor said, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. But I'm a dangerous woman. We suit each other. The wedding was not the quiet affair Eleanor had once dreamed of. It was a display of absolute power. Held at a cathedral that the Yun family had literally bought for the day, the guest list included prime ministers, CEOs, and the heads of every major crime syndicate in Asia. The Beaks had been quiet for days, too quiet. Hyeon's security was everywhere, disguised as waitstaff and choir members. As Eleanor walked down the aisle in a gown of white lace that hid a ceramic blade in her bodice, she locked eyes with Hyeon. He stood at the altar, looking every bit the ruthless king he was. When he took her hand, his grip was a silent vow. "You look breathtaking," he whispered. "Let's get through the vows before someone tries to take my breath away permanently," she replied. The ceremony was halfway through when the heavy oak doors of the cathedral were blown off their hinges. The Beak family patriarch, desperate and ruined by Eleanor's financial sabotage, had gathered his remaining loyalists for a suicide mission. The cathedral erupted into a symphony of gunfire and breaking glass, but this time there was no panic. Hyeon didn't push Eleanor behind him. He stood back to back with her. Eleanor drew the handgun concealed under the altar's floral arrangement. She moved with a cold, calculated precision that left the guests in awe. She wasn't just a bride, she was a Valkyrie. Hyeon fought with a brutal, terrifying grace, clearing the center aisle while Eleanor picked off the snipers in the balcony. It lasted less than 5 minutes. The Beaks had brought a knife to a war that Eleanor had already won with a keyboard and a steady aim. As the last of the intruders fell, Hyeon turned to the priest, who was shaking behind the pulpit. "Continue," Hyeon commanded, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. That night in their new estate, a palace of marble and glass overlooking the sea, the adrenaline of the battle finally gave way to the heat of the union. The wedding dress lay discarded on the floor, a heap of white lace stained with a single drop of red. Hyeon pressed Eleanor against the cool glass of the balcony door, his hands exploring every inch of the woman who had fought beside him. "I've wanted this since I saw you at 18, he groaned against her skin. "But I didn't want a doll, I wanted this. I wanted a queen." Eleanor arched into him, her heart thundering. The power she felt wasn't just from the family name or the money in the bank. It was the raw, primal connection to the man who saw her for exactly who she was. In the shadows of the room, their movements were a celebration of survival and a deep, possessive love. Every touch from Hyeon was a claim, and every response from Eleanor was an equal demand. They were no longer two families united by a contract. They were two souls forged into one by blood and fire. Months later, Eleanor stood on the balcony of the Kang Yun headquarters. Beside her stood her mother, Sarang, and her father, Charles. The Beaks were a memory. The Kangs were more prosperous than ever, and the Yun syndicate had successfully transitioned into a legitimate global powerhouse, though their steel remained sharp for anyone foolish enough to test them. Hyeon walked up behind Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist. He placed a hand over her stomach, a silent acknowledgement of the next generation of the Yun-Kang legacy growing within her. "The fortress is gone, Eleanor," he whispered, looking out at the city they now ruled together. Eleanor leaned her head back against his shoulder. She thought of the girl who used to wonder where her mother went in the mornings. Now, she knew. She was the one who made sure the world kept turning. "We don't need a fortress," Eleanor said, her voice steady and proud. "We own the world outside the walls now." As the sun set over Seoul, the dragon and the crane flew together, unified, unchallenged, and infinite.